Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's event, the Boundless Plains of Speculative Fiction. I know nothing about speculative fiction. I will. Grace Chan was meant to be here this afternoon, but Grace is unable to attend, and that's a great loss for us. But Rhett Davies, his novel Hovering, which won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an unpublished manuscript in 2020, which is a huge achievement because, believe me, the number of entries to that award number in the hundreds. Because everybody thinks he, she or they can win that award. But only one person wins that award, and that was Rhett. That novel has since been published. It is called Hovering, and it has been widely acclaimed, and it's a beautiful novel. He has a PhD in creative writing, so correctly he is Dr. Rhett Davies. Unlike Matt Neal, who is not a doctor, he's more a patient. He is a journalist and fiction writer, which seems to me to be a distinction without a difference. He has spent 17 years at the Warrnambool Standard. You're no longer at the Warrnambool Standard, are you? But an incredibly experienced journalist. He joined the ABC in 2018, and he's been reviewing films for the ABC since 2004. So welcome everybody to what I'm sure will be a marvellous discussion.
First of all, despite what it says in the program, and despite what Bob just said, Rhett Davis is joining me today, not Davies. You did, yeah. And you even asked about that beforehand. You're claiming you're Welsh now. Okay, right, fine.
Wait a second, I'm Welsh, and that was Davis is perfectly fine.
Yeah. Yes, we are talking about speculative fiction today, but I mean, because it is a shame that Grace couldn't be here. Her book, Every Version of You, is outstanding as well, and I would have loved to have had the opportunity to talk about that and ask questions of her about that today, but that couldn't happen. So instead, we just get to talk about Hovering, which is an amazing book. I can't recommend it highly enough. And I mean, speculative fiction is such a broad term. It is a term that can encapsulate both Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and also the Twilight books. So that's, there's a lot in between there. Did you think that this was speculative fiction? Did you have in your head at some point that someone was going to label this as such?
I mean, yeah, this is more veering into the Twilight territory than maybe. I mean, look, labels are always pretty uncomfortable, and I understand the need for them. Like from a genre point of view, we need to have genres to be able to sell books and have people actually understand what sort of books they're getting into. And speculative, I think, is probably the best approximation of what I'm trying to do. I don't exactly know what it is. I think it's a term, I could be making this up, but I think it's a term maybe talked about by Margaret Atwood originally to talk about the way her sort of fiction, which is that kind of very, it's very cerebral fiction, but it is often quite magical and quite science fiction influenced. Whether it's speculative or science fiction, I don't really know, and I'm not really sure of the difference, to be honest with you. But it's, and you can talk about other labels like magical realism, and you can throw other sort of things in there too. I ultimately don't really know what it is. I mean, the other sides of it, I usually call it an absurdist sort of novel, which is, again, a little bit inaccurate. Fabulist is probably which is not fabulous. It's fabulist. That's another one I like to use, but people kind of look at me a bit strange when I say that, so I tend to just say speculative.
Right. Is it and fabulist in the sense you feel like this is a fable?
A little bit, yeah. Only because a lot of the writers that I was influenced by, particularly here, like going back a few years, probably Calvino, those sort of people would probably described as a little bit of a fabulist kind of writers. I'm not exactly sure of the origins of that particular kind of genre in a sense, but and I think it's been a term that's probably gone out of fashion a little bit, but what Calvino was doing was very it's something similar, I suppose, where you're kind of taking an existing sort of reality and skewing it a little bit. I mean, it's not dissimilar from what science fiction, certain types of science fiction do as well, really.
Yeah, or magical realism, as you mentioned too, where it feels like the real world, but something is just off a little bit. It's a little fantastical or something, which is not a bad description of this. Just by show of hands, who's read Hovering? It's been out for a long time, so you've got no excuses, people. Okay, it's about 5 people.
That's a really good number, so yeah.
Opportunity to sell lots of books today, then, aren't we? Would you like to give us the elevator pitch for it?
Yeah, I love elevator pitches. But it's only because it's a tough one to sort of summarise, really. Basically, it starts with a woman called Alice who's been away from her hometown of Fraser, somewhere in southern Victoria, for 15 or 16 years. She sort of leaves where she's been living in Europe for that amount of time, and she leaves under fairly mysterious circumstances. She's kind of fleeing home. We don't really know why. It gets spoiled pretty early, but you find out pretty early. And she comes back to her sister, Lydia, who basically doesn't want to see her. They've become estranged for a long time and haven't really talked for a number of years. But Alice sort of thinks Lydia is the only person that's really left for her to kind of rely on. Into this mix is Lydia's slightly odd son, George, who is sort of doing his own thing. But there's a city... The city they come back to, Fraser, is, for want of a better term, kind of transforming itself on a daily basis. So it's going and moving streets around, and you might wake up and your mailbox is in a neighbour's front yard, sort of somewhat magically. A building might be, another suburb away. That starts off being fairly subtle to begin with, but it gets a little bit messed up. And so that's really the beginning of the book, I suppose. Where it goes is just kind of where it goes. If in a sense, it probably gets stranger, I suppose, is where I would...
It certainly does.
I'd say.
I have to say that when Jo told me that we were going to do this panel, she said, you'll love this book. And all she said about it, it's about a city that moves around. I'm like, I have no idea how that works or what it means, but it captured me immediately.
To be clear, I don't really know how it works either. I just did it. And the mechanics of it actually are pretty... I mean, it's...
You don't explain it in the book at all. And so did you go back and forth about, do I need to explain this? Or were you always set that this is a thing that we don't need to know how it works?
Yeah, I mean, I'm drawn more to sort of fiction that makes me question a little bit. And... I'm very well aware that some of these questions you ask where they, it's pretty ambiguous ultimately why it does this in the end. There are some hints as to why I think it does, but I was asking the question and I didn't really give a full answer, I think. So yes, I had hoped maybe by the end of the book I would have the answer. As it turns out, I probably didn't. But I think some of the characters in the book kind of vaguely allude to the answer, if that makes sense. Okay. So I was working through it as I was writing the book effectively. I asked myself this question. And look, the idea of that the city doing that in the first place is a little bit allegorical in a way. It is a bit of a metaphor. From a personal point of view, I've always sort of felt a little bit strange about the way we've, I feel like ultimately our cities are a little bit broken in Australia for obvious reasons. I think they in a sense shouldn't be here, right? And that's sort of where, as a descendant of British settlers, I'm deeply aware of that and always felt pretty uncomfortable with it. And it's a weird sort of expression of that in some ways. I think it's ultimately where it was coming from. In terms of the book, though, the answer is something for the reader to work out. I like those books, though, that ask those questions and leave it for me to kind of really establish the answer to.
That level of ambiguity where you don't explain the actual mechanism of it, which some people will be frustrated by, but was there ever any pushback, or did any of your readers or publishers go, can we just get a bit more clarity around this? Or
yeah, they did.
Did they really?
Yeah. There was one. I won't name the person. Who yes, they definitely wanted more in one respect. Not my publisher or my agent or anyone there. It was And I did ask myself the question: Is this doing enough?
Yeah.
But I really ended up resisting it because I think the questions it asks, personally, anyway, and doesn't necessarily have the obvious answer to is much more true to what I'm trying to sort of do.
Yeah.
Look, it's potentially frustrating. I do ultimately think, though, if you look hard enough, you can see the answer in there.
Yeah.
It's not immediately obvious. And I guess I'm trying to do there is to sort of show that there are maybe different interpretations of cities. Obviously, everyone is kind of experiencing these places from very different angles. Everyone's perception of a city and the way it should be is completely different. And so I wanted it to be a bit of a multifaceted possibility, if that makes sense.
I think what I loved about it in the end is that you don't need to know. I think to appreciate the book, you don't need to know how this city moves and regenerates and transforms all the time. It kind of becomes irrelevant because, and I've said this to you before, but I think this is one of the most thematically rich books that I've read in a long time. There's so many different layers and threads going through it, and how we view cities is just one of them, and how and colonization is another thing in there. There's stuff about the anonymous nature of the artist and whether that influenced art and all this kind of. There's so many themes in this book. We were talking about this beforehand, but you said there was something that one of your lecturers said to you about, if you're going to write, throw everything at the wall. Tell me a little bit about that process.
Yeah, I mean, to start with there, I was originally more of a short story writer, so I'm attracted to that quick exercise of ideas that you can sort of get through when you're doing short stories. You can do something as I think Ben Moth was saying this morning. You can do something very, very. You can turn it over fairly quickly and move on to another idea. I mean, obviously there's polishing and all that stuff, but I do enjoy that kind of movement. And in a novel, you are locked in. I was locked in for I think 3.5 years, maybe 4, possibly, and that can be frustrating, I think. And so at some level, I wanted to invoke a little bit of that element of the short story within the novel at some level, with it being more of a themed kind of thing too. But what you were talking about with I did my MFA in Vancouver at UBC, and I had a supervisor there who, Maureen Medved, her name was, and no one will probably know who that is, but that's okay. And she was a wonderful, wonderful writer in herself, but she just, and it was one of those things that just crystallised perfectly what I was doing. I was trying to do another novel at the time. It's never going to see the light of day. It was really bad. But she was, I think, detecting something in me that I was kind of holding on to things a little bit too much. And she said, look, you have to trust your imagination a little bit. Trust your own mind. Do not leave everything behind. Put it all on the page right now. And that sort of stuck with me. And that's obviously not going to be the answer for every single novel that anyone's writing, but it was an energy I wanted to capture in here, is that to some extent this was kind of my last attempt to get something really out there in a novel sense. I'd done a few before, and I really thought, look, I've got to put everything I have into this, and so I stuffed it full of a bunch of stuff.
It is full of a bunch of stuff.
And that can be a bit much, but I like to think it's sort of the thematic elements kind of weave together pretty okay in the end. But
they really do. And that was going to be my next question: is how do you balance them? I mean, you've got things where there's characters who are there's themes about withdrawing from the world and getting lost in online communities instead of engaging with the people around you. And there's, as we said, there's colonialism. There's things around art and artist collectives and anonymity in that. And all of these things, how do you sort of balance all of those as you're going through? Like, how were you able to keep those threads sort of weaving through the whole narrative?
Yeah, with a bit of difficulty, I think, at times. But I mean, I think one of the things that could have kept me going through it was it's a fairly, the form of it is a bit of an experimental form in some cases too. So I was able to kind of jump in and jump out of things quite a bit. And what I mean by that is I was including things like computer code or lines of pseudocode in there, and there's a few sections where there is just some simultaneous narratives going on there, and what I was really doing is probably jumping around quite a lot between themes. In terms of keeping them all in mind, I don't really know. I think it's just that was what kept me interested. I don't really have a very disciplined writing mind sometimes. I do need to kind of keep my little brain ticking over, and if I'm on just one sort of line of thought for too long, I'll stop getting interested. So I think it was more that that was what was keeping me interested in writing the novel, to be honest with you. Keeping track of them all, I mean, just through Scrivener, really, just holding on to a few things, and part of it was also, I think, I was doing it as part of a PhD, and I was dragging a lot of kind of my academic research into it a little bit too. Yeah. So holding on to that while I'm trying to do this sort of academic work as well.
To sort of backtrack a little bit on that, with there's so many themes going on and so many parts to the novel, can you remember what what that starting point was? What was the first little idea that became Hovering?
Yeah, look, it was, I was actually returning from Vancouver at the time, and so I've sort of lived in the Geelong area most of my life. I've gone away and come back quite a bit, but I've always ended up back there. And the last time I did that was coming back from Vancouver. I'd been there for 3 years and was flying in, and I'd been writing a lot about lots of different stuff, and I'd never really written about home. And I was flying in and seeing the bay there, and looking out at Melbourne and a little bit of Geelong there, and kind of going, I really feel like I need to do something. It was actually, as I was landing, I think I need to do something about this, but I don't really know how. I've never been a literal writer. I love realist books. I don't write realism. I don't know why. I can't. If I started to try and write about, say, Mirrabel Street in Geelong or some street in Geelong, I would get so bored so quickly. And it's not because the material is boring. It's just that I don't have the right lens for it. And so I started this PhD really before I had the novel in mind, just that I wanted to write about Geelong. And forgive me, this is a story I've probably told a few times. If people have heard it before, I apologise. But I was working at Deakin University at the time. Hello, Kate, who also is at Deakin University. And there's a painting on the wall of the Vice-Chancellor's office there. Very big painting by an artist called Jan Sandbergs. It's called Geelong Capriccio, if Geelong was settled instead of Melbourne. And it's an aerial sort of take, sort of taken from the air, effectively, of Port Phillip Bay, and it is literally that. It's a picture of that whole bay as if Melbourne was a few little farm villages, and Geelong and the Bellarine Peninsula was a big city, and so Ocean Grove was kind of like St Kilda, and there was a bridge over to Mornington Peninsula and all that kind of stuff. And there was just that moment. I mean, what I realised that I wanted to do was to say, I don't have to write about home directly at all. I can call it something else entirely. But it still can talk to that kind of place a little bit and talk to my experience of that place a little bit. And so it ended up being that I wrote this city called Fraser, which if you look at the GPS coordinates in the book, which there are a couple, you'll know that you'll realise that it's in the middle of Corio Bay. It's not actually a real place, but it's sort of in the middle of the water there somewhere. And just sort of completely removed it from actual reality. And it just started to go from there. And I had Alice, who is one of the main characters, just flying in and kind of going, what is this place that she's left and had been away from for 15 years? So that's where it came from to begin with. And it just sort of grew from there.
It is very clear throughout the book that it's Geelong, but not Geelong. Was that a conscious decision to go, I can't call this place Geelong, or naming it Geelong ties it too much to reality, so I have to sort of invent a version of. Is that why that's sort of happened? Or
I thought I was being really clever, but I reckon I wasn't. I thought I was doing something that I honestly thought by calling it something else, I would not need to necessarily talk about it being Geelong and Melbourne a little, because it's a bit Melbourne, of Melbourne too, really. But that was obviously a silly idea. It was because of course it's going to people want to know where things are. I mean, they want to ground themselves at some level. They want to know about place, and that I naively thought I could get away with it a little bit by just sort of calling it a city in southern Victoria. Well, what cities are in southern Victoria really on the coast? There's not many. So yeah, I kind of didn't realise it would come up, but I I mean, I did, but I didn't think it would necessarily be a thing. But for me, it was just a way of. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk about Geelong or Melbourne for that matter. It was just a way of shifting it enough that I could really get to my own sort of strange version of it.
It gives you more freedom to move, probably. I think,
exactly right. Yeah.
I do like the idea, because Geelong, my understanding, comes from Gelang, which is an Indigenous name, and then to replace that with a very white colonial name, because that's one of the really key themes in the book, is about what, the cities that don't belong here, and it's almost as if the moving of the city in one allegorical sense could be like the earth revolting against it in some way. So I thought calling it Fraser was. I thought you were going to tell me there's a really great symbolism there.
That's the first time anyone's actually said that, and that's exactly what it was. I mean, I wanted to kind of the ridiculousness of, and it's not just ridiculous. There's a violence around it, obviously, as well. But the ridiculousness of these European names on these places, and obviously Geelong, is somewhat similar. But I mean, Melbourne, etc. Calling it Fraser was, my grandmother's maiden name was Fraser. Not lost to me. There's an element of that kind of complete inappropriateness of that name for what this is absolutely part of the deal. I didn't get too far into that, obviously. But that's where I was going with it.
And because it is sort of Geelong by stealth in some ways, what has been the reaction to the book from people who live, in that area? Well, I mean, Geelong people have been really good about it. Actually, I think there's not a hell of a lot of books about Geelong. There's a couple there. I actually talked to a few people a couple of weeks ago in Geelong local word festival. There was Kachuk Ketch, who has written a book called Hopeless Kingdom, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin this year, and that's a wonderful book. She actually, and a lot of that is set in the sort of northern suburbs of Geelong, but there's not too many. I mean, look, my main reaction with probably the more tricky reactions to it, I think, have been, I just as one sort of small story, I was at Williamstown Literary Festival, and I was doing a reading from it at the end of it, and this was last year. And for some reason, look, a lot of this probably sounds a lot like Melbourne too, and there's a section in this where Alice is who's come back home, and she's really quite scathing. She's a very snobby sort of character to begin with anyway. And I read this passage where she's really kind of savaging this place that she's from, and I was reading it. For whatever reason, I decided to read it at Williamstown Literary. I probably should have chosen a different passage in hindsight, because it really was. It sounded like I was having a go at Melbourne and Melburnians quite hard, I think. And Steve Bracks was in the audience. He's one of the chairs of the literary festival, I think there. And I think it was a really bad choice. I think I should have chosen a different passage. But generally, people have been really nice, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't think anyone's seen it as being anything but a loving homage, I hope. It's a very, I mean, because the book has been very well received, and I mean, just to take this back to speculative fiction, I mean, speculative fiction is a very broad umbrella term that includes things like sci-fi and reimagined, alternate histories and magical realism and things like that. Do you feel that the book? I mean, do you feel like the sort of magical nature of it was played up a little bit more? But were you worried that the book wouldn't be taken seriously? I think is what I'm trying to get at here.
I mean, not so much in the magical sense, but in the humour sense, because I like to think it's a funny book, but that's not for me to judge. But that was the intention. The magical side of things, I feel, is an absolutely people are okay with that from a literary standpoint. I think sometimes from a humour sense, people start to see that as being less serious, and that's not. I don't think that's true at all. I think there's no reason that humour and serious fiction don't go together. I mean, there's ample evidence of that, but that was the sense that I was getting, that in some cases it was, if we talk up the comedic side of this too much, it becomes seen as a less serious book, and will maybe sell less, or it won't be treated seriously in the awards, whatever. Right. And that kind of irks me a little bit, because you look at someone like and I've used this example before, but someone like Helen Garner, who's a noted sort of serious writer, right? She's funny. She is very funny, and we have this sense sometimes in Australia that there's a sense that I get anyway, that Australian fiction is very po-faced and very serious, and of course, but we're very funny as well, and I don't think we should talk that down. I think it's a wonderful aspect of ourselves and our literature generally. So that was where I got particularly kind of concerned, was more that side of things. The magical sort of space, the science fiction space. Look, it does.
I feel like people look down their nose at that stuff sometimes, especially in serious, when we're talking about serious literature.
Yeah. I reckon that's less of a... I feel we're moving away from that a little bit. I think that's been true. But you look at... I was sort of... I don't know, one of my favourite recent-ish... It's not so much recent anymore. One of my favourite recent-ish authors is... Well, Margaret Atwood's a good example, but Emily St. John Mandel, who wrote Station 11 and... one recently, which was also, that's Glass Hotel, and there was one after that though as well, about we had moon stuff in it. Anyway, it was brilliant, but she's an absolutely literary writer, which I know that's a horrible term because everyone's a literary writer, but very much focused on the sentence and the prose, but she's doing these amazing sci-fi kind of scapes as well. I feel the movement of, if you want to call it literary fiction, to a science fiction space is not unusual anymore. No. And so I like to think that's the case. I mean, you still don't see it quite as much, but I mean, even people like, I think Kate Milton-Hall has sort of gone in that space. She might be here somewhere as well, but it's lots of Australian writers potentially have been doing that, and I think that's perfectly good. I think we're in a bit of a science fiction-y kind of era in some ways. I know it's a weird thing to say, but
yeah. I'm always interested in writers, their path to publication, and because you won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award, which obviously then but tell us about your path to getting published, because you said you worked in short stories a lot prior to that, and yeah.
So I was. I mean, I like I said, I was always a sort of more of a short story writer, and I loved that form, and still do. But it was challenging to get a book out there with that for me. So I'd been probably doing that for a number of years, and I just decided I had to sort of give the novel a crack. And as I said, I enrolled at Deakin and did that as part of a PhD. And I was on probably the last round of edits of this. I had this before I submitted it to the thesis committee or whatever. And I was done with it. I hated it. There was a winter where I was like, okay, I just got to get this finished, then I can finish this stupid degree and I can just get the hell out of here and I'll never write another thing again. I was at that point, really. I was very frustrated. And as you know, as writers, we go through those moments where we just, we're not sure if we can do this. And so I had this winter where I I just destroyed the manuscript. I went through 50% of it and just kind of tore it all to shreds and started again. And that took me a good 3 months of that. And I'd always had in my head that I would submit it at the end of my PhD to the Victorian Premier's Literary Award, but just because it was a thing that was a goal. It was a deadline that I could try and hit. And I didn't think it was ready by any stretch of the imagination for that. I thought, oh, look, I'm not there. But I don't want to wait another year to submit it. I've just got to get it done. So I sent it off. And I spent a few months just kind of finishing up the academic side of things. And I was actually presenting at a conference in Sydney, just an academic thing. And it had a bad... I don't know if you've done any of these academic things where you or these conferences where you put a paper out there and people just sort of go, yeah, all right, mate, whatever. It was a bit of one of those. I felt like I kind of crashed pretty badly. And so I wasn't feeling all that great about myself. And I sat down afterwards and I sitting next to a guy and I recognised that he had done a talk about W.G. Sebald. And I love W.J. Sebald, one of my favourite writers. And I said to him, the thing is I'd never said his name out loud before, and I said to him, I loved your talk about Sebald. And he just looks at me and goes, Sebald. And then he walks off. And I'm just at this is pretty much low. I'm at a pretty low level at this point. And it was seriously about half an hour later, I'm sitting there having lunch by myself because I'm feeling a bit sad. And the Wheeler Centre called me. And I was like, why? What? Okay, they left a message. I better call them back. I don't know what that's about. Why would they call me? It's probably a ticket that I've missed or something. And yeah, they called me to say I've been shortlisted for this award. And it was just this sort of moment of, I had to hold on to it, obviously, because you've got to be very quiet about it, for months. And it was just this lovely moment of, I've got this I'll hold on to this just for myself for a little while. And and so that's where, and from then it was just I don't know when it was announced, maybe a few days later, a few weeks later, I'm not sure. And then agents start to call you and publishers start to call you, and that was really where it started.
It's the winner of the 2020 Victorian Premier's Award for an unpublished manuscript, which usually what follows from that is it becomes a published manuscript. So
it's a good award like that in the sense that a lot of the shortlisted people get the same sort of treatment, really, which is lovely. So Ali Richards and Emily Spur, both of whom are wonderful novelists. Both we were all in that little graduating class of that one, which was lovely. We got a little club.
You've mentioned a few writers, and I'm going to pinch this question from Bob Gott, who asked Hugh Mackay this, because it's always just a good question. It's always very informative, and writers love answering this question. But who are the writers that made you want to write?
I do love this question. I mean, because it's like I was always one of those people growing up. I was always a music person growing up in terms of I couldn't play music. I just wanted to, I liked listening to it. And I've always wanted to be guest programmed on Rage, but I obviously never got the chance.
Everyone's dream.
That's exactly right. No one's asked me yet, but so it's similar. As a kid, it was Robert Louis Stevenson. It was Roald Dahl, Edgar Allan Poe, Enid Blyton. Some authors you might. But still sort of very imaginative, very high sort of, joyous kind of writing. And as I would move in as an adult, sort of more, as a teenager, sort of more fantasy, the Tolkiens and so forth of the world. In the 20s, it was science fiction. So a lot of Philip K. Dick and Ian Banks and those sorts of things. And then I started to get quite irritated with that, and I wasn't sure where I was going. And then I hit upon, in my mid-20s perhaps, Haruki Murakami. And that was the author, and David Mitchell for that matter, two authors who made me just kind of go, okay, you can do the slightly, weird stuff, but you can also keep it contemporary and keep it in a sort of fairly modern lens, and that was really what kicked me off a little bit there. These days, it's sort of more people like Lydia Davis is a huge. I'm a huge fan of hers. George Saunders, is probably my spirit animal as far as writers goes these days. I mean, aside from being a wonderful writer and everything else, he's an amazing literary citizen and very, very wise. But just his short stories in particular, are magical to me. There's a lot. I mean, Calvino, I probably reference a little bit because of his just Invisible Cities in particular was something I wrote quite heavily about as I was writing this, in the sense that it's such a strange novel. I mean, it's all like little fragments of different cities, effectively, that all are supposed to be versions of Venice, but all are kind of these made up cities. Very strange. How you can even call it a novel is questionable at some level, but he was a huge sort of influence as well. I could just keep naming people, but you know.
Well, it's funny, all the ones you mentioned, you talk about the ones in your teenage years, in your 20s, you were just mentioning a lot of, sci-fi and then, Murakami and all those kind of, it totally makes sense for a book like this because of that level of, there's that grounded sort of part of it, but also that fantastical element as well. When this came out, did it feel like, they say you spend your whole life writing your first book and then you get 6 months to work on your next one or whatever it is. But did it feel like this was the accumulation of all of that, teenage years of reading and even going further back to your childhood? Did it feel like this sort of an end point to a lot of that sort of stuff?
I think so, maybe without realising it. I mean, I think ultimately I've realised after I've written it that a lot of the writing I'm trying to do is trying to evoke that childhood spirit of reading, which I didn't sort of realise that's what I was doing. I mean, I think it's what attracts me about the sort of writing that I'm doing and that sort of George Saunders or maybe Jennifer Egan kind of style of fiction, is that there is a sense of childlike wonder in the adult world, and that to me is something I don't really want to let go of for some reason. I find it quite inspiring. But yeah, look, I don't know that I necessarily. Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest with you. Yeah, that's not a great answer to that question, but
it's fine. What you were just saying there, I guess there's a sense of freedom in some of those sort of magical sorts of things. You can do things you can't do in other genres. I guess that speaks to that level of fun as well.
Yeah, it does. And look, I think the thing that it allows you to do, and maybe kind of why I like the idea of that alternate history or alternate reality kind of version of these real places, is that it does allow you to. You don't have to necessarily explain. You can just have things be. I mean, you go back to the Kafka sort of story of, oh God, which one is it? Metamorphosis.
Metamorphosis, yeah.
Where, why is he a bug? I don't know. Just a bug. I mean, and it makes sense in a sense that there's a thematic kind of reason for it at some kind of level, but does it really make sense? No. And that to me is kind of thrilling. I love that kind of. It's also, I do like the idea of metaphors that don't necessarily explain, that aren't necessarily direct. You can't necessarily get a clear connection to what this is about from these kind of strange little alternate things that you're doing. But yeah.
And it's also just such a great cop-out as a writer too. You don't have to come up with the answer.
Yep.
We'll open up to some questions in just a sec. But one more thing I want to talk to you about. There's an artists collective in this that is, I mean, Banksy is the obvious sort of thing that kind of comes to mind. There's a group of artists who are running around pretending that they're all kind of this Banksy. And this feels like one of the things where a very disparate kind of theme that was sort of brought into the novel. It makes sense in the whole scheme of things, but was that something that you was exploring, that idea? Did that sort of come as you were working on this, or was it something else that you pulled in? Because it does feel like a really separate kind of beast a little bit.
It kind of was. I think I'd written a couple of short stories in that same vein, and I the idea of a kind of roving pack of artists that pretend to be one really amazing artist who can do all these different things was just this weird idea that I kind of have been wrestling with for a while. And it was just a vehicle for imagination, I think, more than anything else, because you can kind of see in the sort of the titles of the various pieces of art that they come up with and the various kind of things they do around the place that I'm clearly having a bit of fun with that. I'm obviously not a visual artist. I'm a very enthusiastic amateur viewer of art, but I have no talent or in that area at all. But look, it's something that I definitely brought in. It probably warrants almost another novel. I don't think I'll go there with it, but thematically it was something that I wanted to bring in. Ultimately, it's a bit of a it's what's kind of driving Alice, I think, in the beginning, really more than anything else. But yeah.
I mean, we were talking about this before about how there are so many different ideas in here that some of them I think other authors would go, oh, that's a whole novel in itself. So I'll pull that out and keep it separate. But they're all just they're all in here. You just throw them all. You certainly. Yeah,
and as someone was saying this morning, the problem is I can't really reuse that. I can't. Should I maybe
unless
have
it's a
done
sequel
a novel on that
or a prequel?
I mean, and you could. I mean, you could do that, but I like I say, I think I trust, possibly naively, I trust my imagination to keep pushing. I doubt that I'll revisit it again, although I'm somewhat tempted. I'm writing a second novel at the moment, and I think what it does allow me to do is sort of I can extend a little bit. So I'm not necessarily it's not a sequel to this, but there are elements from this that I'm picking on that just little bits and pieces here and there that it's almost like there's a logical continuation. So
there was one thing you said before too that I almost forgot about. But I can't let go. Is that you at some point just completely stripped out 50% of the book, and so you must have. What happened what was the change there? Why did you go? Okay, how did you figure out what isn't working and what didn't work, and then what did you do?
I don't know about anyone else who's a writer in here, but I have to schedule my editing and my writing according to my moods. And in winter, my mood, because we're in southern Victoria, my mood goes down like that, very, very severely. A little bit of seasonal affective disorder there, but the timing was that I had to get this damn thing done by August or September, and so it was more of that kind of like I feel I need to if I'm editing, I'm going to edit really, really tough within that time.
Literally just stripping it out.
It was basically going through it and. It was that whole page has to go, that whole page has to go, that whole page has to go. Not necessarily saying I'm going to just tweak it. I'm rewriting that entirely. And it was a bit of a frantic few months, to be honest. And I wasn't confident, but I think it ended up obviously, and that's, you can't always, your mood shifts as you're going through this thing over the years. And it was probably the best thing I could do in the end, is to give myself a really, really tough edit. But
difficult thing to do.
It was difficult, and I worried that I'd broken it. Honestly, I thought maybe I'd pushed it too far, but maybe not.
Well, the awards and everything says you did the right thing. So, and question, yes.
And it got published at the end of the lockdowns. And I haven't read Invisible Cities when I read your book, but now that you've raised Calvino, it seems to me that your city, which I thought was Melbourne,
a lot of people do think that. That's okay.
It's like one of those cities in Invisible Cities. I mean, it's not Marco Polo talking about it, it's somebody living in it, and all those cities in Invisible Cities are very tentative.
Yes.
You know, they might disappear or go down the cabin or whatever. There's a scene in it where the woman is going to work, I think, or on an errand or something, and off she goes, and when she's done whatever it is, the road isn't where it was, and she has to just deal with it and come back another way. And then there's a conversation with someone who wants certainty. And in Melbourne, we were always hearing people talking about how they wanted certainty, as if you could have certainty during the pandemic or a war or, you know.
Or in real life.
Oh, yeah. And I just wondered if that sense of frustration with people just unable to deal with it fed into the way you wrote any of that at all?
It's a good question. And look, first of all, the pandemic stuff, it was very weird to release this book when I did. I mean, because first of all, as you said, I finished it before the pandemic. And it was 2 months before the pandemic started that award happened. And then, I was able to actually launch it with real people. Luckily, I was very lucky, and a lot of people didn't get to do that. Look, for me, it's a bit about the way the city's doing that. For me, it's a little bit about we're constantly wanting our places to be certain things, and we obviously can't have our places being exactly the way we want them. At some level, if I'm going to explain a little bit too much here, perhaps, I feel that the city is doing what it's doing because it's trying to please everyone, and it can't. And because that's impossible, that's obviously impossible. It's impossible for a place to be perfect for every single person. There is no such thing as a utopia. A utopia for someone is a dystopia for another person, right? And so that was kind of what I was trying to feed into, and it is a bit of an inversion of the Invisible Cities thing, whereas it's one city and it's a bunch of people in it, as opposed to Calvino's version of that. But yeah, look, that was the impetus behind it, I think, and that not so much a frustration with people's inability to sort of recognise the lack of certainty, but just expressing that, you know, the ground at our feet it feels pretty unstable. And look, the way it happened over the pandemic, it felt much more so, obviously, didn't it? And so it was very weird having to suddenly have this. Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you.
If not read it, go and buy a copy.
Yes, you're very kind. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. I do appreciate it.
Just more questions. Yes.
I'm really interested in the relationship between the increasing amount of people who undertake PhDs in creative writing and the actual production of novels. And so my question for you is, why did you undertake the PhD?
Why did I?
That's a very good question. Thank you. Why the hell?
A lot of people who do it ask
No.
that of themselves. Yeah.
I had a great. It was great. I had a. It was onerous, and it's not always a easy fit, to be honest with you, because you have to do I did one with an exegesis component, so it was 70% novel plus 30% exegesis, and it's the academic side of it was really a little bit foreign to me at times, I have to say, and I really struggled a little bit with it. But what it gave me was access to one of the most amazing supervisors I could have had. Was Maria Takalanda, if anyone who knows her, she's wonderful. And I was able to sort of access her brain, first of all, which was just an absolute delight to be able to have. So that side of it, you get a one-on-one kind of mentoring, which is pretty rare, I think, and something I'm struggling with my second book, to be honest with you. But also it was a case of I was able to get a scholarship, and I was able to do some sessional work there. So I was really able to sort of devote a lot of my time to the book. And I cannot do that now. I have to work full time in a completely unrelated industry, and it's a little bit tougher. So I think there is an element of, yes, it's a strange fit for novelists in some ways, doing a creative writing PhD. However, if you can kind of configure it in the right way, it can actually be really, really wonderful and life-changing. And it was for me. I actually ended up really loving it. It's hard, but it really got the best out of me, I think.
Balancing a full-time job and finding time to write is really difficult. Tell me, what's your writing practice? How much are you sort of trying to get a day, a week? How does yours work?
It doesn't really work at the moment.
That makes me feel so much better.
Yeah, it's really, look, honestly, at the moment, I'm really struggling with it. But I will tell you the idea. The idea is that I get up at 6 and I write until 8 and then I go to work. That doesn't, in practice, work very often. But it is challenging, and I think you're in a constant, as writers, we're in a constant, most of us who aren't earning, much money from our books, which is most of us, have to sort of balance life, family, and work and the writing. There's no getting around it. I don't have kids, so I don't have that kind of pressure, and that does make things a little different from my point of view. But I do work full time in a job that's pretty mentally taxing, and it does require this channel shift.
Yep.
It's not easy, but you take what time you can get. I try and give myself sort of days off here and there. But really, it's about, if I can give myself a good hour every day or so, that's usually the ideal, and it's usually a morning thing for me. I have to sort of anything post sort of lunchtime, I'm pretty much asleep. So I'm not asleep here at the moment, obviously, but normally.
Does it still give you joy? Does it still feel like an outlet, like an enjoyable hobby when you're doing it, even though you have to grind out those hours to find that time in your schedule to do it?
Yeah, look, I think again, we're going back to the session this morning a little bit here, but I was listening to them this morning talking about that, and I really don't. I agree with them in the sense that I wouldn't want to do this if it wasn't joyful. I think you do. I understand writing can be hard and it's difficult, but if it's always difficult, if that's all it is, then you've got to wonder why we're doing it.
Maybe find a different hobby.
Yeah, and there's going to be some really tough stuff. And sorry, I think this was the memoir session, and there's some really that I'm talking about, and they're dealing with some really tough stuff.
Yeah.
So that's a different kind of thing. I'm not dealing with really difficult, traumatic sort of things. When you're just doing fantastical fiction like I am, it's got to be fun.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think you can detect as a reader if the author isn't having fun in a book like this.
Can you think of a book that you've read where you can tell they're not having fun?
I would never name such a book. But yes, I probably can.
They're here tonight.
I will. No Australians. Definitely no Australians.
Another question? Yes.
Yeah, I'm very sorry I haven't read your book.
But that's quite okay. It's an easy way to remedy that.
Yeah, there is. I'm thinking about Margaret Atwood, which is kind of where it started, speculative fiction. It strikes me that speculative fiction often is a cautionary tale. And you might have mentioned that. You spent a bit of time talking about Indigenous, the period we're in. Would you like to respond to that cautionary tale?
So your book is cautionary about a lot of different things. It's about there's elements of like internet addiction and isolation, and as well as there's Indigenous. The Indigenous experience is only sort of kind of alluded to in a lot of ways as well.
Yeah, and I don't want to get in. I didn't want to get into too far into the Indigenous experience because it's not mine, obviously. But obviously, it's something that I don't think we can clearly ignore. I don't like books that moralise or tell me how to think. And so that's where I'm talking about sort of not necessarily tying up all the loose ends. Sometimes that's where I'm coming from. And I think I heard Richard Flanagan talking about this, and he said something very good that I've completely forgotten. But he refuses to sort of explain a lot of the things he's talking about. And that's really I don't want to be quite as strong-willed as he is about it. But I don't think I'm sitting there trying to tell anyone how to think about the world and any sort of particularly cautionary tale. However, I do want to sort of show a few things. When you're talking about internet addiction, one of the characters does have a clear. I don't necessarily believe in internet addiction or video game addiction necessarily. I mean, there is an element of that. But one of the characters is really struggling with the outside world, effectively, I think, and is just immersing herself in video games. And it's something that I can kind of, at some level, relate to and have seen a bit of. But I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing necessarily. I don't think it's really... Some writers might want to do that. I prefer to sort of let the reader kind of work that out a little bit and maybe point to an area of interest. And if you're talking about like someone like Margaret Atwood, I think she's pretty careful with that sort of stuff too, although she's very clearly moral in what she's saying. it's not necessarily saying this is how you should think. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
There was another question over here somewhere. Did I see? Yes.
About technique, right? You've got lots. I've not read your book, but there's lots of threads happening all through it, right? And there must be events that depend on other events happening first. How do you schedule your events? Do you have any tools that let you think, well, this can't happen because this hasn't happened first? Do you have any tools or a technique that? My main technique for this, and because it was going all over the place in terms of its form and all that kind of stuff, it's very linear in sense of time. So there's no flashbacks, there's no real kind of, I know what you're saying in terms of dependence, but that made it a lot easier in the sense that I'm just going forward. And that's sort of how I write generally. I'm just moving the clock forward, a day at a time. A lot of the sections don't necessarily depend on each other in some ways. So I've got sort of little interjections in there that are kind of more about the world around them, things that are going on that don't necessarily have to rely on things that have come before. It's more sort of painting, the way I kind of sort of see it, it's more kind of painting like a impressionist or like a pointillism sort of picture where you're just doing lots of dots that end up becoming a picture in itself. That's sort of where I was trying to head with it a little bit. I do have a central narrative through that needs to have those dependencies that you're talking about. It wasn't too challenging in that sense. It was really just a matter of laying down that kind of path for those characters and then kind of jumping off and around a little bit and for just in a fun way for the most part. But I didn't know no particular techniques, just kind of my brain doing what it does. Not sure that's going to help you, but that's what it is.
I suspect I know the answer to this question before I asked it, but I asked it at the crime session that Rob ran. But are you a plotter or a pantser?
It changes. I start at the start, and I go from there.
But do you write anything out beforehand to say?
That's a very evasive answer,
No,
isn't it?
yes.
I apologise.
That sounds like a pantser. That's if you.
I'm somewhere in between. So I need to know where I'm going at a vague level. So I would tend to sort of have I start with an idea, and this idea was this plane coming into a place that it was like a bit topsy-turvy, and then I just start, and by about 3 pages in, I go, okay, where the hell am I going? I need a map. And so I probably veer a little bit between, but probably mostly a pantser, if I'm honest.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. And what was your term, Hayley? A panther. You hunt down the story. Is that perhaps better descriptive of you?
I'm more of a deer in the headlights. I'm much more like, what the hell is going on? I don't know what I'm doing.
We're going to have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid. But thank you all for coming along. Thank you, Rhett.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you all.
Yes, if you haven't read Hovering yet, please, as Molly Meldrum would say, do yourself a favour. Thank you all, and thanks, Joe, for letting me have a microphone.